Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ideological Oasis, where we are taking a deep dive look into what cancellation, DEI, censorship, all that has the impact has had on counseling and our field in general and education and practice. And today we have Suzannah Alexander, who is doing a lot of research into really fascinating topics on this, as well as had her own experience with cancellation in a grad program. And she writes an excellent Substack I would highly recommend. It is hilarious and also very informative, called Diogenes in Exile. So thank you so much for coming today, Suzannah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Suzannah. Yes,
Suzannah.
just
Okay.
like the song. When I was little
Okay.
that used to bother me, but I'm past it now.
Okay. Well, before I started recording, we sort of started talking about our shared Buddhist path. And I'm curious how you got into Buddhism, and maybe we can start there and wind our way into your experience in grad school.
Okay, well, let's see.
Yeah.
How did I get into Buddhism? I think that my history with that goes back to before I realized what it was. I remember being like
Mm.
10 years old and sitting in my cousin's Camaro and hearing her talk to one of my other cousins about meditation and what meditation was. And I remember just being fascinated with, well, what is this? You just kind of sit there and you do nothing. How does that work? And so I was just sitting in the car and just deciding, well, I guess I'll just try and do nothing for a little while. And I thought it was the weirdest thing. And sometime, I think it was sometime around 2004. I had first moved to Alaska. I've
Mm.
moved around a lot. My ex-husband moved for his job, and so as a family, we followed. And one of the things that was always difficult about that is the first 6 months when you're in a new place, you don't
Mm.
know anybody, and it's so lonely. And you kind of have your partner to rely on, but it's never really quite enough. And
Mm.
going through that over and over and over again, put me in a place where I really was, I learned to be more reflective. And I consider myself an ambivert, but I was able to slide more into an introverted side. And
Mm.
it was right around then that I started to look into books from the Dalai Lama. And I read a couple, and I got myself a little singing bowl. For a little while there, it's like, oh, let's make some noise on this little singing bowl. This sounds so great. And then just sit there and be quiet. But it was more the way of thinking about things, and a way to align my thoughts so that even though I might have been, feeling like lonely and sad, I didn't have to live as a lonely and sad person, because I had these little kids that I had to take care of. And I'm chasing them around, and we're discovering hockey for the first time, which was amazing. Love hockey. um, and that was something that carried me through from there. Moved on from
Mm.
Alaska to Pennsylvania, and I just got more
Mm.
and more comfortable with that as a way to arrange my thoughts and to do what I had already figured out, which was pause before I allow my actions to, give myself a an opportunity to have a choice in how
Mm.
I would respond to things. Um,
Mm. What a great groundwork to have for the time period we found ourselves in.
Yeah, yeah. I've been, I lean on it quite a bit, even though I
Yeah.
would consider myself just a terrible Buddhist, because I don't keep up with reading things. I'm constantly doing stuff and not meditating, and you know all of that.
I can really relate to that. And it's funny, I've never heard anyone's early like Buddhist origination story that sounded like my own, and
Mm.
yours sounds like mine, where I was a teen and I just I don't know if you had this in the 80s. Pier 1 was a
Yes,
store in
yes, we
Houston.
had.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Well, for some reason, Pier 1 was like my heaven. And I would go in and they had all these interesting teacups and shrine materials and Buddha
Mm.
statues. And I started making shrines, not knowing they were shrines, but like little tableaus in my bedroom. This is in Houston, Texas. My
Uh-huh.
mom was like, what are you doing? You know? And I would create these little settings. And then when I was 15, someone handed me a book, Shambhala, Sacred Path of the Warrior
Mm.
by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and another Tibetan
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist. And I read it and I thought, oh my God, I am a Buddhist. I just know this is how I think about the world. So I got on my Pier 1 meditation cushion and immediately failed. Could not, you know, could not stop my thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
which is what, of course, I thought as a teen, what you were supposed to do when you're sitting down and meditating.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it set a lifelong course for me that there's just what you named, which is that there is a difference between what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, and that there's someone observing that. And that was the big aha moment at 15, even though I didn't become a really regular meditator till my 20s, was, oh, there's an observer in there. So that
Mm-hmm.
means I can slow down this whole reactive process eventually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that
powerful.
it is. And I've just been so, I feel like that has been one of my big fortunes in all of this,
Mm,
is to be able to
mm,
create a separation from all of the stuff that is just kind of swirling around. It's very helpful. It's just a very helpful way to think. And for
yeah.
me, that's what it is. And
Mm,
if I remember at all that it is Buddhism, I describe it as a practice, because that's
yeah.
that's what where it fits in my life. I grew up in North Carolina, kind of
Oh,
sandwiched in between two ministers, so I have a real heavy dose of Christian mythology, and with
mm,
that sort
mhm.
of parables and framing and that sort of thing. Um, but that's how it's all for me. It's so much about the way that I conduct my internal thought business.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I grew up in North Carolina as well.
Oh,
Um, I was in Chapel Hill.
Oh my gosh, I was in Fayetteville,
Oh,
right
wow.
right outside of Fort Bragg. In fact, well, it's Fort Liberty now. I'm never going to remember it's Fort Liberty,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, right there. All of my peers were kids who had their parents were on base.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's I wonder, I'm always thinking about protective factors and things that protected me from being completely absorbed into the cult of progressive ideology. And I often wonder if being Southern has been something that maybe has protected me from true capture.
Hmm.
I don't know if we're contrarians or traditionalists or both, but maybe there's something in that.
Yes, I think that there is something in that. I mean, for
Mm,
me, I think it probably is more of being contrarian.
mm,
My
mhm.
dad was just a terrible contrarian. He would never he was not a cooperator. And
Okay.
I learned that from him. I learned it from watching him. It's your fault, Dad.
It's a great skill in a kind of environment like we're in psychology, where conformity
Hmm.
is the word, is the only option unless you want social punishment and to be ostracized. So I think it's a great skill to be a bit of a contrarian. Did you find that it was in your program when you started that it was immediate, that you immediately felt like, hang on a minute, or was it a slow build?
It was a little bit of a slow build, And what I found in my program is the way that they set it up. I think they tried to disarm us when we first came in, because like I was aware that it skewed fairly liberal and, kind of progressive, which I considered myself a moderate. I didn't have a problem with that, but I definitely wasn't all the way to the left, progressive. But, I thought, moderate, that should be okay, right? Um, and yeah, when we came in for our orientation, we were even encouraged to think of it as a brave space, and they used that terminology. This is a brave space, and to me, that said, "Oh, okay. Well, we can talk about stuff. We're open to ideas here." And
Sure.
One of the things that has fueled my drive to do all of this research has been trying to understand what happened, what the heck was going on there, first, how, what actually just happened to me, and and then more, how did counseling get to a place where this is what they were doing to people? But with regard to when I first started, I thought that it was, I thought that there had been a shift that had happened, and maybe they were opening things up, and they were, we're right here in Tennessee, so, maybe they're not as deep indoctrinated as Pennsylvania, which is where I had moved from, and things had gotten, started to get kind of shut down up there when I was living there.
Yeah.
So it took me a little bit by surprise, even though looking back on it, there were these little indicators, like very early on, which is when I first had my first issue with the Buddhism. I was in class, and we were just talking about how we would manage our feelings if we had one of those clients that's really pushing your buttons. And my response, wasn't even thinking about it as Buddhism, but, I said, well, you can, reduce your, your sense of, and I used the word identity, but probably should have used ego, but, reduce that, and, just view them through the lens of your values, which, that's the whole thinking process for me that is so helpful. And one of the other students called me out and said that it was a privilege not to have to think about my identity. And I was just like, that's really strange. What is, I didn't even know what that was about, why, anybody can do it. I can show you how. You got 10 minutes?
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. You weren't into the coded language.
Not at all.
You didn't know that was like almost like a propaganda that student was repeating, I bet.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the end of the class, the professor came up to me and said that, that style of thinking, was invalidating to other identities. And
Whoa.
yeah. And I'm just like, whoa, that's really kind of crazy. And then within the next 36 hours, two other professors, one who I didn't, wasn't even in the classroom, came up to me and said that thinking was invalidating, was problematic for other identities. And I assumed that I must have explained it wrong, because that central practice, that I've heard it called the doctrine of the non-self. That's what I think of it as. And it's something that I just do, and I don't really think about it very often. So trying to verbalize it, put that into words, I'm sitting there and I'm talking and I'm listening to myself, and I'm like, you sound like a crazy person. That doesn't make any sense. Nobody's going to understand that. So I assumed that, man, I must have really explained it wrong this time. And I knew that Buddhism, so much of it had been incorporated into psychology. I mean, I was, I had come in, being well aware of acceptance and commitment therapy,
Mm.
dialectical behavioral theory, and
Yeah.
like it never occurred to me that Buddhism, like that thinking pattern, would be seen as anything inappropriate. So it had to be like I had explained it wrong, because like it's part of what they're supposed to be teaching
Right.
us. Like
Right.
it didn't compute in my head at all. Like
Understandably.
yeah, it just I was just I was like, something that that can't be right. That just didn't make any sense at all. And
Mm.
from there, I kind of kept behaving the way that I normally did. And
Mhm.
as time progressed and we hit, one of the things that I'm much more aware of now is part of the way that they um, evaluate students is they have regular periods where they look over your what they call your dispositions, and those include your beliefs and thoughts and other things. And so when they hit the point where they had their, they have a faculty meeting and they discuss students' dispositions. At that point in the semester, I was called into my advisor's office and I was told that I was transphobic and that my thinking was too concrete. And it was at that point, which was about the middle of the semester, I realized that, oh no, things are really not great. I mean, I had had little clues before then, and I had started to feel some unease. But
Mhm.
when I got that email,
Yeah.
man, I just, I couldn't eat for the whole weekend.
Oh,
I
yeah.
went I
Yeah.
went into that meeting and I'm like, man, this is a great diet, but I feel, just absolutely panicked. it was
Yeah.
it was
Well, to
terrible.
be so misunderstood and misaligned with no, I mean, there's so many levels of what is betraying about that as a student, and you're in a vulnerable position as, entering a profession. There's so many ways, let's say that their viewpoint had any validity.
Hmm.
The first thing they could have done is ask you how you came to your assumptions and be curious about how you came to that worldview. But
Hmm.
instead, it looks like it was a very um, ideologically captured program from the beginning where you were being evaluated for your thoughts.
Hmm.
And the disposition trial sounds terrifying. Like that sounds like a post communist. That just sounds I'm just shocked. I'm sitting here feeling very surprised, and like that must have been so scary for you as a student.
Oh yeah, it
Yeah,
was absolutely terrifying
yeah.
because I came into the program, after I had gotten divorced, and
Mm,
I
hmm.
had a window where I knew that I would be able to afford
Yeah,
to go
yeah,
and to
yeah,
not be working,
yeah.
and to be able to. I thought that I hoped that I'd be able to recover the tuition and be able to start building back some sort of
Mhm,
retirement nest egg after
mhm.
the 2 years. But I felt I was very firm on I had a limited time that I was willing
Yeah,
to do that in.
sure.
And the degree is not cheap. Those
No.
degrees, 2 years is it's at UT it was $40,000, and that's a lot of money. So
Yeah.
I spent you know several months, almost an entire year, making the decision and looking it over and looking at
Mm,
other alternatives and,
mm.
seeing what was possible. And yeah, I felt like I really had a lot wrapped up in that. How am I
Yeah.
going to get back on my feet? How am I going
Mm,
to, be a, a strong figure
mhm,
in my family,
mhm.
for,
Yeah.
for the young people that I have been raising. I wanted
Yeah.
that was important.
Yeah.
And it was terrible. It was excruciating.
I can only imagine. I'm just thinking about how, even in just our brief conversation, you sound so values driven, like your
Yes.
values and your integrity. And I can see why this has bothered you so much.
Hmm.
And you've taken it to this wider level where you've started to look at the structures and how to use a term, dismantle the structures that enforce this ideology and oppression. So did you leave after that experience? Did
I
you continue on?
I left at the end of the semester. I got to
Yeah.
the end of semester, and during the course of that, one of the avenues that they had, which was supposed to like help students,
Hmm.
was a support plan. And a support plan was supposed to help you if you were having, issues. I was
Mm.
already feeling, I was by far older than any of my other classmates by a good 20 years. And,
Hmm.
it was difficult to do that and to go back and to be socially just kind of not really quite fitting in.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
hard enough by itself.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then to have all of this ideology coming from the professors, and looking back on it, there was, regular reminders, or where it was interjected during the class saying, you're going to need to be thinking about this all of the time. And it was framed very much in a very anxiety provoking way. Like you're
Hmm.
never going to be culturally competent, but you have to work at it all of the time. You always
Yeah.
need to be improving your cultural competence.
And
And
there's no redemption for the color of your skin. You're sort of always in this privileged position that you can never be redeemed from.
right,
Is
right.
that? Hmm.
Yes, and we were
Hmm.
told at one point, how we were supposed to do the work and
Right.
like recognize our privilege, but we need to make sure that we didn't ask people of color, because then we were burdening them with our whiteness. And so it's kind of like, okay, I'm supposed to understand what these people
Hmm.
are feeling and what they want, but I'm supposed to do it
But
without
don't
asking
ask
them.
anything.
Yeah, don't
Yeah. Don't
ask.
ask any
Yeah,
questions. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's like I I,
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that.
Well,
It just
yeah, it's not possible. It's the double bind so that you just stay stuck and stay guilty, I think.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm so struck with how I keep thinking about the Buddhist framework, and I'm so struck with how one of the things, when you're working with meditation, you're noticing all the things that your mind generates and the stories and the dramas and your patterns. And it's a very self-reflective process. There you sort of start to question reality when you're meditating, like, is this my perception or is this actually true? And I think if I had been in your position and I knew I had this window and there was sort of a time pressure and it felt really important to me, I would, especially if I was getting this kind of feedback that I was in wrong think, that there was something about me that was wrong, I would go inward and feel like, oh my gosh, I would start to really overanalyze. I've done something wrong, and then how to work with that in my mind, um, and try to get myself or my ego out of the way. I probably would have been tangled up a lot longer than it sounds like you were. It sounds like you had some clarity pretty early on that it was them and it was not you. Sorry, that was long winded. I'm wondering if you could tell that it was them and not you.
Um, I it did get a little bit blurry for me at
Hmm.
times,
Hmm.
because initially, like I said, I thought that I had explained it wrong, or
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know there was something about the way that I was trying to communicate that
Hmm.
maybe I wasn't communicating what I was
Yeah.
thinking and feeling well enough. And
Yeah.
what I did is I went back to a lot of my, what I think of as, my grounding sort of texts. So like I have all these old psychology textbooks, because I'm just that kind of person. It's like I want to like dig and read more,
Mm.
and I pulled those out, and I went through, and I'm like, well, okay, I'm obviously not quite getting this right, and I'm like, well, how do I make sure that I'm communicating well,
Mm.
and that I am,
Mm.
making sure that I'm accounting for their perspective. So I went back and, I made I statements. I had all of my
Wow.
I statements and said, so, well, like, this is
Yeah.
me. And
Yeah.
like, whatever that is, that's you. And every time I tried to do that, it just kind of blew up a little bit more because
Yeah.
like I wasn't supposed to be allowed to have
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And it came to
Yeah.
a big head in my groups class and
Mm.
in my small group. And I got mobbed in that. It was really
Oh.
ugly a couple of different times.
Oh.
And that was toward the end of the semester. And
Mm.
in part because of that, where I guess I stood my ground there because did I came with my I statements and I said, this is me, and like, that's you, and you
Yeah.
know you can take that
Yeah.
however you want to. And after that point, then the professor for that group's class would not approve me to move on to practicum, which would mean that
Wow.
they weren't formally kicking me out of the
Yeah.
program, but if I
Right.
was going to stay, it would
Yeah.
require an additional year, which would be an additional year out of the workforce, an additional
Mhm.
year of tuition. And
Cost. Yeah.
I had decided before then that I was not going to do that. I mean, I had, I had, I had realized that I was on the cusp there, and I'm just like, I'm not going to do
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
I was having thoughts that, I remember having, little thoughts saying, no degree is worth this. No
Yeah.
career is worth
Yeah.
this. It's not,
Mm.
I recognized that this was abusive treatment.
Yeah.
And, while at the same time, there was another part of me that was like, they're telling you that you are the most terrible person, and they are,
Mm.
supposed to be authorities and all of that.
Mm.
Maybe there are some things of,
Mm.
in myself that maybe I haven't
Mhm.
quite figured out. And so those two sides were competing
Yeah.
internally. Um,
Yeah.
and I hung on enough to the side that said, this is the limit. I'm drawing
Yeah.
this line right here, and I'm just going to go
Yeah.
with it. And like, the emotional, the tidal wave just, it just
Yeah.
swamped me when I walked out. And it took me emotionally, well, I'm still working on recovering, but the
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
6 months were really, really awful after
Oh.
getting out. It just, I had a little one of those, those sand things where, you
Oh,
flip it
yeah.
over and then the,
Yeah.
the
Sure.
sand goes
Mhm.
down. I
Mhm.
sat for about 2 weeks and just flipped it over and just looked at it,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and, just crying all the time.
Yeah.
It's not,
Yeah.
so overwhelmed. I didn't know what I was
Oh.
doing or where I was
Yeah.
going. It is one of the most traumatic experiences I've ever been
Yeah.
through. It was terrible.
Well, to be so publicly ostracized and shamed and told you're thinking wrong, there's something dehumanizing about what you, not something, it is dehumanizing what you went through. And the assumption that the people that are the knowledgeable ones in the field that will be conveying this craft to you, because that's what psychotherapy is. It's this beautiful, or it used to be a beautiful craft, that they would then like judge your character. I can imagine it would take a while to come back from that. And I just have so much admiration for you for even looking into what you're looking into, which is the legislation and all the K-CREP fundamentals, and kind of, it seems like you've thrown yourself into how did it get this way as a way to deal with the pain of having gone through it?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
very much. I
Yeah.
very much needed to understand what, what was that?
Yeah. Yeah.
What were they talking about?
Hmm.
In what universe does
Yeah.
that thinking invalidate other people? How do you even get to a place where you would like think that?
Yeah.
Once I recognized that they, really did have a problem with how I was
Yeah.
thinking, and
Yeah.
like they believed that they understood how I was
Hmm.
thinking, like they
Hmm.
thought that they could tell what was inside my head.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I really needed to understand that. And when,
Hmm.
and it seems like the more that I dig into it, the more that I find, and it's just like it's just it blows my mind over and over again. Like how
Can I, how, like, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just have to ask you, like, my big question that I've been dying to know that I haven't, honestly, I haven't done the research like you have. How did counselors ever become advocates? When did counseling become not about the practice of psychotherapy, but the practice of social advocacy? And I feel like you know this. Do you know
I
this?
I do know this answer. I
Okay.
do know
Okay.
this answer. This is one of the things that I found out in the first piece that I
Mm,
wrote.
mm,
But how counseling got to this point, it started back in 1988, and they had a big convention. I believe that one was in Missouri, and it was the, I guess you could say, like the movers and shakers in counseling all got
mm.
together and they had a big conference and they talked about what they thought the future would be and what they wanted the future to be. And it was in a climate where they were feeling some professional anxiety that they needed to distinguish counseling from social work or from, psychotherapy or from, more the kinds of things that psychologists would do. They just, it, the feeling that I get of it is, it's kind of like that younger sibling, it's like, no, I'm
Right.
going to be different. This is
Yeah.
what I'm going to do. And between then and 1998, when they had, these were in Greensboro, North Carolina, but they had these two large conventions, like 6 months
Mm.
apart. And those were by invitation only. And
Oh.
interestingly, the people that didn't agree were not invited. And
Oh, okay.
in the account of those meetings, they talk about those people as obstacles to this future that they wanted. But it was in between those two that Chi
Mhm.
Sigma Iota came up with the idea of advocacy as being the hallmark of the profession. Now, this comes some
Mm,
from those first meetings in 1988,
mm.
because in those meetings, in addition to, saying that, we need to distinguish ourselves as a profession, they also came to the conclusion that counselors should adopt multiculturalism as a value. And
Mm.
they also said that counselors needed to impress that on their clients in the counseling room. So
Wow. That's early.
from the very
Yeah.
beginning, it was
Yeah.
ethically compromised. And
Yeah.
that bit about the, impressing it on clients
Yeah.
later got scrubbed from accounts of the record, but
Wow.
it's never been disavowed.
No,
So
it hasn't. Yeah.
like in 2010, there was another, I think it was 2010, another sort of meeting where they talk about those. And they had, it was 10 or 12 principles that included that they needed to, adopt multiculturalism. There were some other ones that were less important. But they took out the one where it said that we need to impress this on clients and,
Mm.
made up another
Yeah.
one. And that's where it happened. And once they
Wow.
started to focus on being advocates, and it was just advocacy. It was never
Hmm.
defined. Like, I always think,
What is
yeah,
advocacy?
like
Yeah.
what are you advocating for? You
And
got to,
against? What's
yeah,
for, yeah, what are the implications of that? Yeah.
right.
Hmm.
And at that point, the central mission of counseling really, I think, strongly started to drift away from actually providing therapy to people. Um,
Dude, I have this thought as you're talking. So 88 is really when the SSRI biopsychosocial medical, the medical model came into counseling. I'm wondering if it's as a response, like how the behaviorists really rejected subjectivism
hmm,
and the psychoanalysis and all of that early on. I wonder if this is a similar movement where they rejected the more ineffable quality, the craft
hmm,
that of psychotherapy, like Irving Yalom or um, Martin Buber. These amazing practitioners who talked about love and connection. These ineffable qualities that could not be measured in the biomedical model. I wonder if that was a way to sort of validate what they were doing, and by rejecting that, I don't know philosophically if that's even a thing, but that's what strikes me as about that time period in particular. What do you
that
think?
that's certainly a possibility. Um, it would be interesting if there were people who were at those meetings who could be interviewed for that. I haven't found any, and so
Wow.
I've only read the account
Yeah.
of what came from that, and I don't recall them making specific mention about feeling threatened from SSRIs. They seemed to
Well,
be,
maybe it was maybe it was implicit or just
mm,
in the ether at the time. Is like, oh, we need to really validate, and this is the way to do it.
yes. Well, what's
I Yeah.
interesting is, there is what's in the record, but there's
Yeah.
also what's not in the record. So there's not
Mm.
a lot of discussion about how do we do therapy. It's like we need to have
Mm.
these values. They
Yeah.
complained that there were too many white women in doing therapy. We need to, we know that predicting the future is bad, but we can do it anyway. There's this whole section in the beginning where they justify how we're going to, plan for and create this future, while saying, yeah, everybody says that prediction is bad, but, and they just kind of,
Oh, here we go.
yeah,
Yeah.
but here we go. um,
Yeah.
and there's in the entire record, there's really not a lot of language about how do we better connect with people. There's not
Yeah. Yeah.
things saying, like, we have seen these strategies that seem to be working better. There was a call
Mm.
for, we need to do more research, and it needs to be counseling branded research. More like, we need to have our own research.
Yeah.
We don't want your old
Mm.
psychology research. To heck with that. We want
Mm.
our own research so that we can. It was
Mm.
very much about creating an identity for the profession, and that's what
That's
they were. That's what they were
ironic.
talking about. Yeah.
Isn't that ironic?
Yes.
Somehow. Wow, that
Yeah.
is interesting. So this is two things are coming to mind. The first is you said predicting the future, and it makes me think I was on the board of the Washington Mental Health Counseling Association in the pandemic years ago for like 3 years. And one of the reasons I decided to step off the board is that they decided to hire a diversity consultant
Hmm.
because we needed more BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, BIPOC counselors in a mental health counseling association. And they were going to hire this person for tens of thousands of dollars, if I remember correctly. And I asked the question, you'll laugh, I think, at this. I asked, how do we know, where are our measures? What are our demographics so we see what the problem is? And they said, we don't measure that. And I said, so we're going to pay someone tens of thousands of dollars to address a problem that we don't know that we have. And yes, that was very much the case. And this sounds very similar to the origination of the field. Is we're going to predict the future and say that we should have this thing, but we're not going to give any data to back it up or even set measurable goals.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty fair, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. So the other thing that I'm thinking about historically is that in the insurance and managed care happened around that time too, right? So really validating the field, having insurance cover therapy. I wonder how much that is involved in
I
creating an identity as well.
Yeah, I think that that was a big part of it. And even when I was in the counselor training, there was talk about how do we get the counseling as a therapy covered under Medicare and Medicaid. And
Yeah.
if I
Yeah.
recall correctly, and that was something that it wasn't covered until Biden was in office. And that was one of the changes that he made, is that
Yeah.
now counseling is covered. And I believe he is also responsible for counselors having to have the degree from a KCREP accredited
Ah.
college in order to work with the VA, with the Army,
Mm-hmm.
and to get
Yeah.
the TRICARE certificate. Um, all of
Yeah.
which is just like, I think, not helpful.
Yeah. And this brings me to the next big topic I wanted to talk about with you, which is I've been talking about this idea for the past while as I learn about these things with personal stories of counselors and canceling, is that we need a different credentialing body. This is what I keep saying, is we
Hmm.
need an alternative credentialing body, an alternative to KCREP that each state chooses to honor or not. And then lo and behold, I read about your research on this and that there is another organization. I was wondering about your thoughts and what you uncovered around that and what you think moving forward would actually help.
Well, what what I've uncovered primarily, so in the buildup of all of this is when, back in the early 80s, early 90s, when KCREP was formed. And by the 1988 or the 1998 meetings, they were given the directive to do all of these different things, to
Okay.
make sure that multiculturalism was added into the curriculum, and this is how it was all supposed to do. And the ACA, their job was to go out and make sure that the KCREP accreditation was required in all of the places that it could be.
Yeah.
And you
Which is
can,
all the training programs basically and
right,
state licensing boards, I would
right,
imagine.
in the
Hmm.
licensing boards. Now,
Hmm.
with regard to alternatives, I've seen just a little bit of, I can't even remember what their name was, but I've seen a little bit of one. I'd have to go
Yeah.
back into my research and look that
Yeah.
up. But there are, there's the competition with the marriage and family therapy, that accreditation.
Hmm.
There is the COMFI, which
Mm.
covers some of those as well, but they're so
Hmm.
much smaller right now. And
Yeah.
from what I've observed, I haven't dug deep into their regulations, but I haven't seen significant differences.
Well,
What
that would be the thing is like the difference would be how do we eradicate the DEI or the ideology out of the credentialing boards?
Mhm.
So and I guess that's a question. This was a conversation recently in the Texas legislature to remove the diversity language from the multicultural requirement. So I guess from your point of view, do you see a difference between multicultural and diversity, equity, inclusion? Do you think they're important for counseling?
um, I don't see significant difference there.
Mm,
The way that multiculturalism is taught, it's, looking at these textbooks, it's taught in terms of stereotypes. I'm not
yes.
sure how this is helpful at all.
I
It,
remember this from 2003 when I had my graduate work, and I thought it was the most ridiculous. It was Wing Su, Daniel Wing Su. I think
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
his name. Yeah, so even back then, 20 years ago, he was writing the textbook. And instead of talking about white privilege, they hadn't gotten to that yet, but they were talking about, this type of person does not like eye contact, and this type of person does. And I thought, this can't really be true. We can't, I mean, people are way more nuanced. And I was in my early 30s when I was in grad school, and I was thinking, really? This sounds like a stereotype.
It's very much stereotyped, and
Mm,
and I think what you know, I think that counseling wants to apply this idea of how they think things should work
it
onto the
shouldn't.
culture. And
Yeah.
what's getting lost is there's a relationship between culture and psychology.
Hmm.
Psychology is a cultural answer to
Mm,
a culturally identified problem.
right.
If we
Right.
are to run into a person and they're hearing voices and
Yeah.
they're behaving in strange ways, we say
Yeah.
that person has schizophrenia.
Right.
We don't call that person a prophet. We
Yeah.
don't say that, we need to all follow their
Hmm.
lead and do those sorts of
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
And so that's how our culture responds. And
Sure.
there's a the culture should be leading and psychology should be following. But
Mm,
with the injection of the multiculturalism, they want it breaks down those walls. And
mm,
it becomes more, well, if you came from this culture, maybe, that's how you do things, so we'll just do what you do when we're talking to you. There's no
mm,
integrity at
mm,
all. And
mm.
no, we totally lose what we think of as reality on those
I see what you're
grounds.
saying. So there's
So
like a fidelity to the psychology model that in some way has to be first, but also seen through a lens of how the person's perceiving their issue. Is that what you're saying?
yes, so like the
Okay.
way that I would think that you would best manage someone who was from a radically different culture from the dominant culture would be to
Mm-hmm.
get their understanding of where they
Mm-hmm.
were.
Mm-hmm.
You have to learn from them,
Yeah.
because you're trying to address the individual. You're not
Yeah.
trying to treat their culture. They
Yeah.
are in a new culture now. That's the
Yeah.
reality. And that's the reality that you need to
Mm,
work with and try to
mm.
accommodate both as much as
Yeah.
is possible. But there will be
Right.
things that won't be allowed in our
Mm-hmm.
culture, because we
Mm.
have to have some sort of boundaries.
Yeah.
Is honor killing, is that
Yeah.
wrong? I think it's
Right.
wrong here.
Yeah.
Foot binding,
Yeah.
female genital mutilation.
Yeah.
We have to have an understanding of things that
Yeah.
we don't allow. And
Right.
that that's how we stay culturally coherent. I mean, that's
Mm.
something that I think is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a huge problem with this whole
Mm.
multicultural counseling idea. Is it makes our culture incoherent. It leads to
Ah,
cultural incoherence.
I see.
And
Yeah.
it I just don't it's not functional. It doesn't make sense.
Well, the UK is definitely struggling with that right now, socio-politically, and also in the rape cases and all the grooming
Hmm.
gangs. That's definitely an issue there.
Yeah, that all of
Yeah.
that has been quite shocking. I mean,
Yeah.
I I think I can't decide whether it's more shocking that it's happened or that people are just now waking up to it. I heard about that maybe a year ago when I really started to get into it, and I was like,
Hmm.
wow, and they're not doing anything about it. And then
Yeah.
it that it took Elon Musk tweeting about it,
I know.
for there to be like this waking up. Oh yeah, maybe that was a bad thing. Just
Yeah.
I find it mind blowing. It's
Yeah.
completely incoherent. You know, it,
Yeah.
it it's almost like there has been a compartmentalization of
Yes.
these different things, and we can't
Hmm.
talk about that because that would put us in
Yeah.
bad territory to even bring it up.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of similar to what we're talking about too, is that by not allowing there to be preferences, so we have a preference of a dominant culture where we prefer not to do honor killings,
mhm,
and then we create a value system and laws around that. Um, that's a coherence. But there's when we equally prefer or each culture as its own pocket, then how do we live as a society with grooming games that are acceptable in that culture and not in the culture that they're embedded in? And you get silence, basically, and complicitness and collusion and real greed takes over. So those politicians wanted the constituents' votes in those areas, and suppressed the police from investigating. So that's where the real like nasty human behavior can enter when we don't have a coherent narrative, basically.
yes, and I
Hmm.
think for me, that's where I lean into the um, more spiritual side of
Mm,
Buddhism.
mm, mm,
I've tried, I continue to try to find like rational ways to say,
mm,
well, what is it that rationally would make
mm.
honor killing or something like that bad? And
Mm-hmm.
it certainly, is painful and,
Yeah,
you know, causes harm to
yeah,
the people that it happens to.
yeah,
But I find that the argument that seems more salient to me is just that it adds suffering. It adds
yeah.
suffering, and why would I do that? Why would I add suffering
Mm-hmm.
anywhere?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's some, the people who have been doing the grooming are going to have to suffer because they're not going to be able to do that anymore. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that,
Right.
I think that that's where we need to have some sort of coherence about
Yeah.
what are we going to agree on that is
Yeah.
allowed. And
Right.
for me, I I am, I suppose, looking at it from a certain amount of self-interest. I'm not a tall woman,
Mm-hmm.
really kind of a small person, and
Mm-hmm.
I would not want to be in a world where it was might makes right. That sounds like that would be pretty
Yeah.
bad for me and people who are like me. And
Yeah.
I don't see in other examples throughout history where that
Mm.
has led to flourishing for everyone.
Yeah.
And it does end up, you do kind of end up in a bit of a
Mm.
utilitarian place because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there will always be edge cases that are going to fall outside of it. But I think that the most coherent goal is to try and create as much flourishing for the most people that you
Mm.
possibly can. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm still thinking on that, but I haven't found another way to, you
Yeah.
know, find that
I like
coherence yet myself.
I like the way you articulated that. It makes me really think about Konstantin Kissin's Oxford talk and the thing that he said about what will move us through what a lot of people feel like is a dystopian time is innovation and inspiration. And I think about that a lot. Like you're talking about flourishing, what creates flourishing and less suffering. I think about that in our field, in the psychology field, is how do we create a new psychology that helps human flourishing? And it's certainly DEI certainly does not do that. It there haven't been studies specifically, I think, on counseling. There has been in social psychology. Lee Jessum's paper came out a while ago, the social psychologist, that says DEI is harmful. Um, but yeah, what creates flourishing and how do we make sure that counseling, or let's say, now that I know that there's really a difference between psychotherapy and counseling, that this field of psychology, how do we make sure it's not captured by the next thing?
Well, I think that what I observed in those meetings is that there were some significant structural issues in the way they put them together from the very beginning. So, like, one of the things that didn't happen is there was not discussion about having dissent. There was this group, and it was kind of like, we're the popular kids,
Yeah.
we're in the positions of power, and we're going to tell people what to do. And by
Yeah.
the time, a decade later, there was dissent, but they were already outside of the room. They weren't invited. They were listed as obstacles.
Mirroring what's happened with the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there has to be structures that force conflict. These different structures should be adversarial. If we're going to have accreditation, and I think you can make some good arguments that accreditation all by itself is not helpful.
Yeah.
It really limits innovation, and it's based on the idea that we already know what is going to make for the best education. And I think with only 200 years of institutionalized schooling, I don't think we know what really makes for great education. I think we need way more innovation, and it gets in the way of that. But if we are going to have it, it needs to be genuinely adversarial to the universities. And right now, the way that it works is the universities pay for accreditation. They pay directly. So it's like, that's where they're getting their money from. So how are they going to have, it's a conflict of interest right there.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things should not be happening. You can't have any integrity if you're paying for the thing that says you're doing a good job. It just means that you have enough money to pay somebody to say that you're doing a good job. Those sorts of things will make the difference, I think.
That is fascinating. So I'm obsessively listening to the Heterodox Academy's Censorship in Science conference. It was just released on YouTube a few days ago, and I'm devouring it. And I would highly recommend it because they are talking about credentialing and funding in science and censorship, and it is so parallel to what is happening in our field. And they're talking about how the IRB, the review boards, are in this way really set up for safety, but limit research and limit. You have to be able to have conflict. They're saying no harm can be done anywhere, but how do you define harm? And conflict creates innovation. So it's interesting. There's a parallel here. I can see how this is an upheaval in the whole world of science, with psychology included.
Yes, it's definitely impacted the scientific research, and there's been so much that has been blocked. Where people are they're even afraid to. There was a study that I wrote about some months ago that showed where people are afraid to even talk about the things that they would really like to study or what they believe in the research fields.
Yeah.
And in other things that I found in the textbooks for counseling, their research standards, half of them are based on postmodern ideas of reality. I think one of the things on a research level that needs to happen is it has to go back to an empirical basis as much as possible. To the extent that things can be measured, they need to be measured. This is important.
So qualitative research really needs to be rethought in that way, and that maybe objective reality has to play a role in these, even psychology studies. I don't know what that would look like exactly, but I'm just thinking about qualitative research and how important it is right now in psychology studies.
Oh,
and how questionable it is.
It is questionable. I think that it's difficult to, psychology has a challenge there because so much of how it works relies on the interpersonal relationship between the therapist and the client. And so it becomes very difficult to try and measure that in an empirical sense.
Yeah.
At the same time, there are the studies that have been done on the people who are super therapists and how they get so much, they get results that are far and away better than other people. And I think that the way forward is to focus on what works and try and find ways to quantify that,
and teach it.
and teach it if it can be teached, or if it can be taught. Some of the things that I've heard about and just heard like little bits of people talking about it is in the dispositions. If we come to a point where we can be honest about heritable traits and heritable dispositions, are we going to find ourselves confronted with, there are certain people who have appropriate dispositions to do the work and some where, maybe not so much. I mean, one of the, we were challenged in my class about who we would see as our nightmare client, and to a person, all of the other people in class said that it would be a male, a racist man, a white racist man. And when it got to me, I should have just said a white racist man, because that's what it, but not picking up on that at all. And I said that, my nightmare would be a narcissist or a psychopath. And, those are personality traits. We know that there is some heritable link there. And, there is a correlation with people who have some of those personality tendencies being drawn to psychotherapy. And like the question, will end up becoming, can people, and I think that some can be very good therapists, but, what exactly are we looking to do in the profession? And would it be safer for clients to, consider that as a qualifier? I mean, I don't know. I don't have the answers right now. And there are, considerations there that even as I'm talking about it, I'm like, that's, it kind of scares me to think in those lines. But I think those are the questions that research should be focusing on right now. And those are the questions that we should be asking for. I mean, if we know that psychopaths, they're a segment of the population, and they can go into the field and can navigate around all of the different gates that we've put up there because they don't feel the anxiety that other people do, and then can wreak havoc on the other end. Wouldn't we want to exclude that? I think you can make a good argument for that, even if I'm uncomfortable with it. I don't know. I don't know those answers.
No, it's fascinating, because what that makes me think of, a way around that or through that perhaps would be simply temperament, instead of heritability, keeping it at temperament. And that's sort of more innocuous. And so that's one option. Temperament. That's interesting. Yeah. I'm thinking about what that would even look like. Because the assumption is, CBT is infiltrated so much, I think, because of the medical model, that the thought is that you learn the skill, you teach the skill, the client gets better. And that's not necessarily what's true, and that's not necessarily what research shows. It is relational, and then there are temperaments. And there's clinical intuition too, which is something I studied a few years ago, and apparently is way more widespread than we really talk about in psychology. Is these clinical intuitions that happen to therapists that have been practicing for a while.
Hmm.
So, yeah, the more ineffable things that are harder to measure are the things that will actually make the difference.
Yes. And I
Hmm.
think that right now, what's happening in counseling with all of this focus on evaluating students for their disposition, which includes their beliefs. Like that's part your beliefs are part of your disposition. So if you don't have the right beliefs, you
Yeah.
can go through all of the training and be barred from graduating at the end. I mean, I
I
don't.
just don't understand how that's even legal.
Yeah,
I don't understand that.
yeah, I don't
Yeah.
understand how it's legal either. And
Yeah.
I think that it hasn't been examined. You know,
Yeah.
when I went into it and it was explained to me, my thought was, it's like, oh well, okay, they want to make sure that, the people that they're graduating are not going
Mhm.
to, hop into bed with their client,
Right.
their first
Like
client.
ethical. Like they'll have these ethical values if you measure their disposition.
Right.
Yeah.
And it may have even started at that point. But
Yeah.
with the introduction and with the
Mhm.
proliferation of the multicultural and DEI ideology, it
Mhm.
became a way to ideologically gatekeep the whole
Yeah.
profession. And
Yeah.
like it puts students in such a precarious position.
Yeah.
If you want to graduate, you really can't say
Yeah.
anything, and you
Yeah.
can't even, like, some of the handbooks talk about how if you're emotionally too volatile, if you're emotionally unstable,
Yeah.
that would be grounds for gatekeeping you out of the profession. So
So don't get upset when they're attacking you because then you'll be
mhm,
accused of being emotionally volatile.
that is correct. Yes,
Yeah.
and while you're sitting there and they're telling you how much your whiteness is a
Oh,
problem,
oh,
and you
yeah.
don't be emotionally unstable while we're
No,
telling
don't
you
be
that.
unstable. Yeah. Let us beat you, but don't cry. Yeah.
Right.
Well, you said gatekeep, and it really made me think about what's happened since the election.
Hmm.
And these in the Facebook groups, therapist Facebook groups, how there's this eruption of therapists that, at least they're very vocal on Facebook, um, that are saying that therapists that voted for Trump should have their licenses taken away. And it's a very contentious time right now because if you show neutrality, at the very least, neutrality with clients or with other clinicians about Trump winning, then you are immediately targeted as someone who shouldn't have their license. And people are saying this in groups, and it's just amazing to watch. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about that behavior in counseling? And yeah,
It's
is
funny.
what do we do?
Well, so like here over the course of the last week, I have been watching The Vow about the Nexium cult, and,
Oh my gosh, that's
and
such an amazing documentary. Yeah.
yeah, and
Hmm.
I've been watching it primarily, trying to figure out how could you talk to people who
Mm.
um, have come from that. And
Yeah.
like I've seen it. I've had some people respond to some of my posts on Substack and some
Mm.
other
Mm.
comments and notes,
Mm.
and they're obviously coming from the idea of DEI is right
Yeah.
and this is what we want. And when you read through what they're saying, you can see that they're not. It's like you can read the cognitive dissonance right there, because they're
Yes.
saying this is the right way, and
Mhm.
we need to take these people's jobs, and they don't have a right to this. And
Yeah.
then you get down to the end, and you're like, and I'm so scared about I'm going to lose my job, and
Yeah.
it's kind of like, okay, let's can we talk about this? And
Yeah. Yeah.
what I've tried to do is
Mm.
employ questions just
Mhm.
to for some of these folks to get them to really think through what it is they're saying, because
Yeah.
I do feel like because when there's, I mean, like, I'm not sure for some of the folks when they have
Mm.
been won over by the
Yeah.
DEI mindset.
Yeah.
Whenever it was that whenever it was that that happened, they have been
Yeah.
through a period where they have not felt it's an option to say
Yeah.
no or to
Yeah.
even criticize. So that's a pretty hardcore indoctrination.
Yeah.
I see it it's very cult like. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
to break through that, just to plant seeds with questions. It's like, well, okay, um, okay, we take these people's licenses and we get them fired and lose their jobs. At what point do we stop?
Yeah.
What if we do that and they still like Trump?
Yeah.
Should we
Right. Right. Have they
should
learned their lesson?
right,
Yeah.
should we
Yeah.
round them up?
Yeah.
Should we put them in camps? Should
Yeah.
we make them
Hmm.
walk the plank?
Yeah.
What are the parameters there? How far are people willing to go? And
Yeah.
like, what do ethics mean to them?
Yeah.
Does personal autonomy, does that have value? Are
Yeah.
therapists allowed to have personal autonomy? And
Yeah.
looking at
Yeah.
the handbooks, that I think that's a big one, because with all of this multicultural training in it, you can read through the books where it actually tells the students, you're probably going to have a really terrible time in this class. We've seen where these multicultural classes have, descended into shouting matches. But is that white students, are they right to say that this training is racist, or are they just having their worldview challenged? And it's kind of like,
Mm.
well, okay, you've just made it so that there's only one
Yeah.
way for them
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
funneled through this.
Yeah.
And there has to be, it's a house of cards, and it's just a matter of hitting the right points to help people who are capable of seeing that
Yeah.
they're internally conflicted, to
Yeah.
break out. And I, I,
Yeah.
I really actually, feel for people in that situation.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had an experience that I can relate to briefly on a Facebook group. I posted something about not appreciate. I didn't. That's distinguishing between DEI and multiculturalism. And oh yeah, I just told you about this. That I just had a conversation right before this conversation, so I'm getting it a little mixed up. But my thought was, oh, so this is the woman who said, you can't help a rich, educated, uneducated white woman. And I thanked her. I said, I really appreciate it because you've just illustrated exactly why DEI is not a clinical skill. You don't know anything about me. You haven't asked me any questions. You've just looked at my profile picture and made a lot of assumptions, which proves my point. And thank you for doing that gracefully. And I wasn't being sarcastic. I was actually really grateful that she did that because it exactly proved that DEI is not a clinical perspective that helps people understand each other. And she apologized. And I thought that was really good. She said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And I thought, whew, there might be a little hope, and in the indoctrination process. And in all my conversations, what it keeps coming back to is cults, and how as therapists, we need to have a whole new set of skills that is about disindoctrination. And how do we do that? And what are those skills? And how do we weave them in with our classical psychotherapy training?
Mhm.
I don't know what that'll look like. I think it'll be a really interesting evolution.
I think so too, and I think that at least, I mean, I'm not in the situation where I can treat clients individually, so I'm just kind of running into people out in the wild, or people who have problems with what I'm
Yeah.
posting and writing
Yeah.
about.
It's a great way to do that sort of counseling process, actually.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
find that, those open-ended questions that,
Hmm.
kind of force people to really examine what it is that
Hmm.
their values are, and,
Hmm.
what they internally think is okay or not okay is the way to start
Yeah.
breaking through.
Yeah.
Because, if you're put on the spot and asked to define something, like, well, what does it mean to you to be
Yeah.
ethical?
Yeah.
There's not a pat
Yeah.
response that
Yeah.
you can just come at and say, it's like,
Hmm.
it just becomes much harder, and it also gets them away from
Hmm.
looking to justify what
Hmm.
they're trying to do. I think that was one of the
Hmm.
things that Peter Boghossian had an insight
Hmm.
about. If you
Yeah.
ask them to
Yeah.
justify why they believe in something, they believe in it more. But if you
Yes.
can put somebody in the position of having to look at it from the opposing
Yeah.
side, then they have to put themselves in someone else's shoes, and it makes
Yeah.
them more open to amending their own
Yeah.
beliefs because they have looked at it from a different view rather than
Yeah.
practiced building a case for their own view already.
It's so good. The street epistemology is so interesting in watching those.
Mm-hmm.
So, so do you feel this has been a great conversation? I'm really enjoying hearing your perspectives. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours, and we
Oh
should talk
gosh.
more.
I could go on. I could go
I
on
know. I want
education
to
and
hear it all. And I guess the thing that I'm really sitting here wondering is, do you feel hopeful? Well, I'm wondering two things. Is it seems like you would have been such a great counselor, and I feel very sad that the field chewed you up and spit you out. And I wonder how you feel about that, returning to it, if at all, ever. And two is, do you have hope for the field?
well, let's see. We'll try the first one. I
Okay.
think that one's easier. Those are good
Okay.
questions. Difficult
Okay.
questions, but good questions.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure that I I've done a lot of lay counseling, and I will probably always do that.
Hmm.
People have always come to me to talk
Hmm.
through their problems. I guess I
Hmm.
just have one of those faces or something. Um, and that will always be part of my personality and my skill
Yeah.
set. I think at this particular moment in history, though, and with the things that I am looking
Hmm.
into and learning, I see myself more being in a position to help build the structures that could make a future
Hmm.
that is healthier for the whole profession. And that's, I think, what I would like to do. I
Hmm.
feel very moved to talk about this
Hmm.
as much as possible. Like, sometimes it's hard
Yeah.
to shut me up. Um, and I think that looking at the structures of how things are built is what's going to make the difference in trying to avoid these problems going forward.
Yeah.
How we build the different institutions and how they interact with each other. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that I could provide some insight there, and
Hmm.
that might be more valuable than being a
Hmm.
counselor at this time.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not like I have a ton of time to go back and get certified and all of that.
Yeah.
Maybe if all of the structures fall down, and I don't have to get a license and I don't have to
Hmm.
do the degree anymore, I
Yeah.
could be a counselor. um,
Okay.
but
Hmm.
I could do that. Now, is in terms of the field, um, I am I really wonder how counseling in particular is going to survive. I, I
Yeah.
think that I think that therapy will survive. The counseling designation, if there's not significant course correction,
Yeah.
um, it may have to crash and burn and rebuild
Yeah.
itself. It's
Yeah.
so entrenched in accreditation. I mean, And it
Yeah.
is my hope with focusing on accreditation. I think the way, I mean, and the reason that I am taking the tack that I am, I think the way to save it, if it can be saved, is to cut off accreditation. And then
Hmm.
universities will be able to chart their own course.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
there are some that are not as ideologically bound as others. So some,
Hmm.
you look at the handbooks and they have the land acknowledgement and the DEI statement and whole
Yeah.
selections, on their
Yeah.
beliefs. That's not going to be a great program, but others,
Yeah.
seem to be trying to take a more measured approach there.
Yeah.
Left to their own devices, I could see them jettisoning that whole part of the curriculum. And
Yeah.
that would be that would be the wing that I think could survive and flourish. Now, it
Yeah.
might have to go through a period where there is a new word.
Hmm.
Maybe they won't survive as counselors, but maybe we'll
Yeah.
call it somebody else. I don't know exactly what that would be. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that the way that our system works, so if we look at it as our rules and laws and then our
Hmm.
economic system, so we have our rules and laws, which are pretty egalitarian, based on the Enlightenment, and then we have
Hmm.
capitalism.
Hmm.
While it has led to this amazing lifestyle, where we can sit and
Yeah.
we can talk over
Yeah.
video, which is
Yeah.
incredible.
I know.
Um,
Yeah.
it does tend to break apart the close bonds that really make
Hmm.
people feel like they're a part of something and make
Mm.
life worth living.
Yeah.
So I think that as we figure our way forward, there's still going to be that need. I think that that need is what underlies this desire
Mm.
to want
Mm.
to have a communist kind of
Yeah.
lifestyle.
Yeah.
I feel it myself. I would love to
Mhm.
have, really close neighbors where I could just, go over and, say, hey, how you doing this morning?
Yeah.
What's going on? Things that I
Mhm.
remember from when I was growing up, when there was less internet and all of that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I think that I think that therapy can still help people to cope with those things, whether it is working through actual problems, depression that
Mhm.
comes on from
Yeah.
that, or maybe their own self-sabotaging kind of
Mhm.
uh, personality issues, that sort of thing. But
Or
I think that
grief
there's a huge.
from or addiction from
Mhm.
growing up in
Yep.
disconnected cultures.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mhm.
And I think that there
Mhm.
is a way and a place for that, and we
Mhm.
just have to find how we get there. We need to
Yeah.
jettison this idea that we have this
Yeah.
DEI super
Mhm.
knowledge that's going to fix everything by making
Yeah.
everybody do what we say.
Or be oppressor and oppressed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and so that makes me wonder if we need to have an international congress like they did in 1988, and we self-select and invite all of the big movers and shakers and say, okay, we are divorcing ourselves. I'm making it sound dramatic because it feels dramatic at this point, but we're divorcing ourselves from counselors, and we're calling them advocates, and we're actually becoming therapists. And so it's the therapy group.
Mm-hmm. I think that that would actually be helpful, because
Yeah.
in order to do that, new structures will have to be built. There'll have to
Yeah.
be new ways to reach clients, new ways to
Yeah.
bill, new
Yeah.
ways to help clients feel like this is a valid profession. So some
Yeah.
kind of licensing or certification or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
But
all
it
of
would
those things.
interface with insurance differently, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so who would you invite to this International Magical Congress where we become therapists?
Oh, wow. Who would I invite? I guess I would, I'd invite the other people who have been through what I've been through, the people who are already
Yes.
working on it, like the folks from Critical Therapy Antidote,
Yeah.
Sally
Mm-hmm.
Sattel.
Mm-hmm.
Invite Leslie Boyce and Aaron Kinesvater and
Uh-huh.
Lauren Holt. She went
Yes.
to two different universities.
Yeah.
And I would invite. Oh man, I forgot his name, but there's a fellow who's done a lot of the research on super therapists. I would invite him,
Mm. Oh, yeah.
and any super therapists that I could
Mm.
find, because one of the
Yeah.
interesting things about that research is he found that it didn't really matter. He even had people who hadn't gone to any sort of training, and it was something about their disposition that was
Yeah.
creating great results. So
Mm.
I would look in some different places,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
see what you would turn up. You might find some really talented people in like AA meetings.
Yeah,
You
or
know,
psychedelic coaching or
mm-hmm,
chaplaincy work. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that sounds like the beginnings of a plan. I would love that. Well, thank you so much for talking today. There's so many different juicy topics we covered, and at some point we should talk again. And I would love to talk with you more about meditation in particular. Have a
Hmm.
meditation episode.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Thank you so much. And so people can find you on Diogenes and Exile, right?
Hmm. Yep.
Great. Yeah, I'm really enjoying your writing and I highly recommend people check it out.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will see you again soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Alrighty.